Hello, my name is Sheryl Battles, and I'm VP of Communications and Diversity Strategy for Pitney Bowes. I'm joined here by a group of colleagues who we just had the pleasure of chatting about the hidden power of inclusion. When you think about the role of professional communicators in the 21st century, these are really interesting times where among our tasks to engage with a variety of stakeholders, to advise the members of the C-suite, to serve as integrators between those relationships in the C-suite, as well as to more effectively help our companies connect with our markets and our clients and our partners and the communities in which we operate. We actually need a toolkit. We need an attitude about how do we possibly navigate the complexities of today's environment in doing what we are tasked with doing, which is building community and connection. I'm joined here by Marta Newhart, a Fortune 100 CCO, most recently with Johnson Controls, Luke Lambert, President and CEO of GNS Business Communications, Anthony Gooch, Director of Public Affairs and Communications and CCO for OECD, and Dr. Rochelle Ford, Chair and Professor of Public Relations, SI Newhouse School of Public Communications in Syracuse University. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to offer their perspectives on given what's going on in the world today. How might we use diversity and inclusion as a way of delivering enhanced business results and connecting more effectively with our company's culture and our communities? I'd ask each of you to say your name before you start to speak. Marta, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'll chime in here. Marta Newhart. Thank you, Sheryl. I think there's never been a better time to make that connection that you draw the line for us, because we as companies cannot do business just in the US. We inherently have to be global. And with that comes the opportunity to be diverse, to have different perspectives. The three companies that I have worked for, all in the Fortune 500, are very global. The Boeing Company, 70% of their business is outside the US. Covidien, which was acquired by Medtronic, 70% of their business is outside the US. And Johnson Controls, 60% of their business is outside the US. So there's no better opportunity than today as we form business partnerships to bring diversity into the equation. But we have to do it. We have to do it. And if we don't, and we don't be demonstrative about it, it's not going to happen. I said earlier, we're very good at measuring diversity, but inclusion not so much. And from some of the joint ventures and business partnerships that I've been a part of, inclusion was where the payoff is. It's almost like it's a formula. And we don't spend enough time on, for one thing, we get them in the door, but then do we know how inclusion is actually working? And I can tell you from a corporate America standpoint, there's room to grow.
Marta, this is Luke Lambert with GNS Business Communications. I wanted to add on to what Marta just said, because when we started our diversity and inclusion program, one of the things we learned from Dr. Ford at Syracuse was that we had to start with inclusion first, that you have to fully understand who you are, because you're not going to be able to attract and, more importantly, retain the right kind of talent unless you could create an environment of full trust and transparency. And so that's where we started. And there were a lot of tactical things to get a program off and running, but they did develop trust. And for me, most importantly, it's enabled us to build a program that's now become a competitive advantage for us. So we're building ideas not only internally, but we're extending them out to our clients externally in new, creative, thought-provoking ways than we've ever done before. And it's truly become a competitive advantage. And one of the things that I heard after our session that I think resonated from people I talked to was that you've made a business case for diversity and inclusion, number one. You support it from the top, number two. And if you do that, then it's not going to become a one-and-done program, and it'll have staying power and be that much more
And
valuable.
it'll be sustainable.
Right.
That's right.
I'm really sorry. We lost connection for 5 seconds. Yeah.
Oh shoot, that was good.
That was really
Okay, Luke, take 2.
Where did you lose
Oh,
us
yeah.
at? Where did you lose us? Did you lose Luke?
Are we back on?
Oh, we're back on.
Oh, so Luke, you got to go again.
I don't even know what the hell I said.
So you got Sheryl and me, and then you lost Luke.
Are we still on? Are you?
Yeah, we are still on.
We're still recording. Okay, sorry. We're back again. Hi, guys.
So what I was just saying was, you start by, with diversity and inclusion, it should actually be reversed and be inclusion and diversity, because one of the things that I learned from Dr. Ford early on was that you need to start by building an inclusive environment and build an environment of trust within your organization. And if you do that, you're going to be able to better attract diverse talent if you hadn't, and more importantly, be able to retain that talent. And then after this session, I think that point was driven home, and I heard from several people afterwards that they were impressed that organizations today are thinking about D&I and making a business case for it first, showing that it can be a competitive advantage, and even tying not only internal results but external results to that as well, so that you can build award-winning client programs around it. And so that's the feedback that we received.
And I think that's one of the key things, is that inclusion is really everyone is at the table. Oftentimes when we get into these discussions, we automatically jump to racial and ethnic minorities and women, and all of those populations are important and often underrepresented on our boards and our companies, or even educational departments, what have you. But the important thing is twofold. Is that as educators, as agency leaders, as CCOs, we need to be able to lead the conversation and to bring up the tough issues so that we can say, should our company speak out on this issue? Is this just an internal conversation, or is this something that we need to speak out externally? We should be having conversations with our marketing division. Are we reaching the potential markets that might be underserved in this area? And who are the thought leaders there? What are the media channels that people go to? And so we often talk about segmenting publics, and oftentimes we use that language about segmentation when we're just talking about oftentimes predominantly white communities. But that same concept of segmentation also applies to all the other communities in which we serve, African American communities, Latino communities, LGBTQ, and all the other different groups, veteran communities. And so we have to figure out what part of identity moves people to act, to communicate, how people understand issues differently, and our comms team needs to be a part of leading that conversation, asking the right questions so that we can really begin to engage different audiences. And when we recognize that we're not familiar enough with the audience to even ask the right questions, then we find strategic partners to help us. Then we look and say, what are we missing on our team to bring in that diversity of voices and ideas? And you very well might start need to recruit more women, more minorities, some veterans, people with disabilities, or what have you. But it starts with that inclusive thing, and it starts with a level of bravery to speak out on issues.
And it feels like, Rochelle, we do that well domestically, but not so much globally.
So people are looking over at me. Well, probably Anthony Gooch from the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And among the many things that we do is measuring the degree to which we have actually achieved diversity and inclusion. And in framing this discussion, Sheryl, you used a very powerful image, which was minding a gap. Minding a gap, because if you do not do so, then the consequences of that can be negative and significant. And in the discussion today, firstly, what I wanted to convey was a sense of where we lie and where we stand, breaking the inclusion and diversity piece down into constituent parts, and dwelling on gender aspects. And when we talk about gender aspects, they apply as much to men as they apply to women. We often tend to dwell a great deal on the position and the role of women. Let's take as a starting point that what we're looking for is balance. What we can see very clearly is that there are quite significant gaps that lie in a number of fields and a number of areas. And the first job when you're going to address any issue is, what's your starting point? So if we start also in terms of where things do start, they start with education. When you're looking at gender aspects, and we know that there's a very significant dearth of involvement of women in certain parts of the educational space, and they particularly relate to science, technology, and engineering and mathematics, so-called STEM. Why? This doesn't just have to do with the fact that, well, girls don't particularly like these subjects. It has to do with conditioning. It has to do with parent pressure. It has to do with, oh, that's just the way things are, and we know that the way things were are very different to the way things are today. So there's a real, firstly, there's a real realization to be had, because we are multifarious. We are working within institutions, within companies, but we also have families, or we know people on different generational levels. And so really realizing that there are some significant issues first up that relate maybe to cultural, historical traditions, etc., that we need to approach and address. And I would say that this is particularly prevalent in maybe in the US and Western Europe, because I think in Asia there is a movement which is quite a lot stronger in terms of involving of girls going into the science, technology, engineering, mathematics spaces. The second area that even today, after all of the progress that has been made, it's still the case that women, for example, in the workplace, they're earning on average 15% less than men, and effectively they're doing the same job. So there were revelations very recently in the United Kingdom. The BBC is a very well-known global brand, broadcaster. Major broadcasters who are men are earning a hell of a lot more than women, and there really isn't any reason for that, any fundamental reason for that. And so how is it that in 2017, in a very advanced country like the United Kingdom, how can one defend that in public service television? If we look beyond that also in the sphere of politics, because we're talking also about framing societal rules, whether it's regulations, whether it's laws, the underpinnings of that. Who's making and framing those things? In the political sphere, in the public space, you have just under a third of women who are representatives, political representatives in most of the countries around the OECD. That means 2/3 are men. Why do we have that imbalance from the beginning? And I think it's important, again, realize where the gap is, and then look to close that gap in a number of ways. And when I was referring to that question of this is as much an issue for men as for women, and in a sense being attentive to men, I'll give you an example on parental leave. So when you're fortunate enough to have a child, what provision is made for men to spend considerable time in that parental period with their children? And the reality is that in many countries around the world, including this one in the United States, no provision is made for that at all. So if you're looking for that balance, if you're looking to include really, you also have to be able to include men in roles that in today's day and age they really want to spend. Maybe they used to want to spend as well, but there was conditioning, etc. And so that is a really important factor. Now, the last point, and this picks up a little bit on Rochelle's observations, is the role that those of us who are involved in communications can play. Firstly, looking at our own firepower in teams. The proportion of women in my team, for example, overall 60%. In professional, sort of more senior positions, what do we gain from that? And what can I talk about there in terms of performance? We have, I would say, a very high level of emotional intelligence in our team. And often you find that intellectual intelligence, there's an imbalance towards intellectual intelligence. If you're looking at comparative advantages in today's day and age, I think that emotional intelligence is going to give you that cutting edge. It's the 360-degree view, the ability to integrate, the ability to see different dimensions and aspects, the ability not to operate in silos, to break out of those silos. And there's another element, which is we use the words, the acronym CCO, Chief Communications Officer. For me, that C is as much conscience as anything else. It's do the right thing. But in doing that right thing, it's also, okay, but why? And then providing the ammunition to be able to justify it to people who don't buy it morally necessarily. Let's not assume everybody buys the same moral standards.
Have the courage to speak up. Yeah.
And be able then to say, actually this makes sense. And so in the feedback that we got today, we had a colleague who works for a women's health company. They took the decision very recently to put 50% of women on their board. And in the last 13 quarters since they took that decision, they have had double-digit growth. Now, if it were 2 quarters, you could say that's a correlation. 13 quarters at double-digit growth, that's causation. That means there's a link between the changes that were made and the results that they are achieving. Another example, Sodexo. You can see they've done very interesting analysis of the best performing parts of that company. It's a company of 420,000 people in 80 countries. Easily the top performers along any measures of success are the most diverse and integrated teams within that company. And it's real life examples like that, walking the walk, being able to show it, that can really move the dial in all walks of life.
So, in summary, when you think about the fact that when it comes to the markets we serve, the clients we seek to deliver value to, our organizations as we look to shape their corporate culture, the communities that we are looking to connect with, along with the partners that we are seeking to work with to innovate. There is a consistent and binding thread of diversity in terms of the markets, the demographics, and the perspectives of the way forward. And corporate communicators and senior communicators in all industries and organizations have an ability, through courageous conversations, through a focus on both diversity and inclusion, which is really what is the power to unlock the benefits of diversity. And through an understanding that inclusion really is about everyone, and the things that make us distinct, as well as the commonalities that bind us as humans. Because at the end of the day, that's who we're dealing and doing business with. Humans doing business with humans. Diversity and inclusion and the hidden power therein are a great way for communicators in the 21st century to do our jobs even better. Thank you.